Well, hello everybody, it's Thor, and today we're going to be looking at the chart of Charles Manson. And I can remember growing up as a child in the 80s and 90s. I remember hearing all about Charles Manson on the news or on the television, and people talking about him being one of the most evil men uh, that we know of. And very popular on the time when I used to watch TV was things about serial killers or criminals. And right now there's been a renewed interest in this idea of true crime. But Charles Manson, when we look at Charles Manson, it's not necessarily that he was a serial killer. He was more of a cult leader that had people murder for him by proxy. So that's really what we're looking at. So when I call him a guru of darkness, that's essentially what he was. And we're going to look at his chart and we're going to find out there was a lot of characteristics, especially when we look at Rahu and Saturn being in the 10th house of Capricorn in Manson's chart. There's this idea of he was able to mesmerize people. He was able to hypnotize them in some sort of way. And of course, he was able to interject himself into the 1960s counterculture with the movement of all these, what they used to call the hippies. And so he was able to chameleon himself right into this open culture of, using intoxicants and free love. And he was really able to manipulate that situation and create his cult, and he destroyed a lot of people's lives through this cult. So we're going to take a look at that. So thank you guys for being here, by the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a presentation. Those of you guys that are new to my channel, please like and subscribe. And my goal is 10,000 subscribers. For those of you that are new to my channel, I do Vedic astrology, which is based on the sidereal zodiac. So your sign may be different using this brand of astrology. Also, if you guys are interested in your own reading, check the details down below. Right now, there's a offer of 40% off all readings if you use codename Thor at checkout through my website. And it's a really good discount. I rarely do it, and it's going to be till August 31st for those of you guys that are interested. So what we're going to do first is we are going to, and let me get off the screen for a second, but what we're going to do is we're going to look at a bio of Charles Manson, just in case some of you guys may have not, may not know about Charles Manson. He did die, I believe, in 2017. So, a lot of the newer generation, a lot of, those Gen Zers and so forth, they might not know much about him, but he was such a huge name for those people, especially boomers, where they were growing up in the 1960s. All of them, basically, Charles Manson was seared into their memories with this horrific crime. And then the brutality of these murders that took place with Sharon Tate and the others that were at Sharon Tate's house. And then, unfortunately, there was the La Bianca killings the next day. But these were brutal, brutal massacres that basically happened. And we're going to get into that when we look at the chart. So here's a little bit of a bio for those of you guys that don't know who Charles Manson is. Oops, we're going to get, hold on one second, guys. Let me see if I can, there we go. We got the brief bio. I thought I might not have the slide. Okay, so Charles Manson, 1934 to 2017. So it's an important point to make that in the 1960s, he was considered a lot older. I watched a documentary on this recently. He was considered older than most of the people that were hanging out at Haight-Ashbury and in the San Francisco scene there. So he had already been in and out of prison many times when he was younger. So he was able to manipulate a lot of the young kids that were showing up into San Francisco in the 1960s into joining his cult. So let's take a look at that. And he had a really troubled childhood, in and out of prisons, enters the 1960s San Francisco counterculture scene. And literally I read in the, in the historical narrative that he literally got out of prison and then went to San Francisco. He formed the Manson family by manipulating followers through substance abuse and free love practices, and he becomes a cult leader. And that was around 1968. So he enters the scene. He had a group, from everything I read, about 20 followers he had in this Manson family. And then what happened is he was a musician. He was trying to get big playing music, and that didn't work out. So basically, he just formed a doomsday cult. So he developed apocalyptic beliefs. He wanted to incite the end of the world through some sort of civil unrest. And there's a book, I believe, called Helter Skelter, which talks about it. He was trying to spark some division and unrest within the social fabric of society. He believed that he was like the harbinger of this. So anyways, this all culminates in August of 1969 with the brutal murders of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others that were at the house there with Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was an actress herself, and I believe she was married to Roman Polanski. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong. And then the next day, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered by this cult the next day. Okay, so these scenes were really horrific. There was, writing on the walls and blood, and it was a really horrible, brutal scene. And all these people that ended up getting arrested, which were Manson's followers, obviously they pointed to Manson. And when they had the trials, it was like insanity there because the followers were acting really crazy. And, a lot of them didn't even really break free of Manson until years into their prison sentences, where they started realizing they had been essentially conned. So we're going to take a look at all of that. So let's take a look at the chart. Let me go back to this really fast. Let's take a look, since so many of you guys are so interested in, what does this look like in an astrology chart? And that's what I'm here to do. It's really interesting to look at these case studies. So when we're looking at Charles Manson, he was an Aries ascendant. And by the way, I got the birth time. It was in the Kala software database that I have. So, and Kala has been pretty good. So I am just assuming it's all documented and so forth, because I found it in the Kala database, which gives me a list of celebrities and all types of people, if you guys are wondering where I got it. So anyways, he's Aries ascendant. So, ruled by the planet Mars. Obviously, Aries people can be very headstrong, very possessive. But on a positive level, they're like with everything, planets and signs, it's both positive and negative polarities. So you can have an Aries person that's an absolute outstanding citizen, okay? But then you could have an Aries person that obviously becomes very negatively polarized. So this is with every sign. There's a dharmic potential, and then there's a negative adharmic potential with that. What I wanted to point out with you guys is, if we look at the rising nakshatra, remember in Vedic astrology, there's 27 nakshatras, and I'm going to explain for a second. Throughout the 12 signs of the zodiac, there's 27 nakshatras, which are like star constellations. And each one of these nakshatras give us a little bit more detail on either the planets that are involved or the type of personality. So besides just being an Aries, when we're looking at the identity of who is Charles Manson, we also can look at the rising nakshatra to kind of hone in a little bit more of what that identity is. And that's what you can do in your personal charts as well. So let's get back in there. Rising nakshatra is Aswini. Aswini. Maybe I said it wrong. It's Aswini. And so Aswini is basically ruled by Ketu. Okay, so it's interesting to note that, remember when we did Ted Bundy's chart, his rising nakshatra was Maga, and the ruler of Maga is also Ketu. Okay, one of the things about people that have rising signs or rising nakshatras that are either ruled by Ketu, like Maga and Aswini, is there is this idea of they tend to be people without boundaries. So they tend to push up against societal norms or societal laws. Okay, there's like this disregard in a manner There's this disregard for laws. Okay. Now, there's a lot of gurus and spiritual people that have, especially with MAGA, you'll notice there's a lot of spiritual people that have this K2 ruled sign because it does help with enlightenment purposes, with people, basically realizing there's no ego there. K2 is really good for that. But the issue is if you have a personality that isn't quite developed and spiritualized, it could be a problem in that they're not realizing the consequences of their actions on society. So that's what we're talking about with K2. So we have that. And then we also, when we're looking at the chart, so as weenie there, and then when we look at the chart also, we're definitely seeing issues with the mother in Charles Manson's chart. So look at, we got K2 in the 4th house of Cancer. Right away, we know there's issues there. But we also want to look at the condition of moon when we take a look at relationship with mother. Well, look at that. Moon is with Rahu and Saturn. So definitely there's issues with the mother. Just based on the 2 charts we've seen with Ted Bundy and then Charles Manson, it does seem that issues with the mother tend to be a big karmic reason for people being very troubled. So there's issues with the mother. Also, when 4th house represents our sense of happiness and the sign of Cancer represents your emotions. So this could be someone very emotionally detached. That's what it can represent. And especially they're detached from happiness. I mean, 4th house is like, are you happy? And this would be like, no, it's very difficult for this person just to be happy. And, I would imagine it was very difficult to be happy when you're in and out of prisons constantly. Probably pretty difficult to have a positive outlook on life. The other thing we want to notice is, remember, we're talking about he's in Aries, and take a look at where Mars is. The ruling planet is in the 5th house of Leo. Sorry. This is a really good, as far as planetary strength, this is really good. Mars is very strong in Leo because Mars and Sun are friends. However, this is what we got to look at is it's giving him a drive towards fame. Okay, 5th house of Leo is all about wanting to become a celebrity, become famous, just like Rahu in the 10th house is that same kind of motivation. I want to be famous. I want to be special. I want to be like larger than life. Okay, so in and of itself, that's not a bad placement. Okay, if we were just looking at this, this person is very ambitious. They want to be successful. They want to be. But it's all these other factors within the chart that we have to look at. We're getting this idea of who Charles Manson is. But from all accounts, even the Manson family documentary that I saw, he was actually pretty okay at apparently music, playing music. And I guess he supposedly wrote something even for the Beach Boys, which I think is disputed, but apparently he was okay, but he never got a record label. He never got to that highest point. But there's this idea of, I want fame, and he's very motivated towards it. Now that by itself wouldn't be bad, but this is what's causing all the disturbance, is Rahu. Rahu's all about taboo. Okay, I don't care how I get the fame. I'm just going to do whatever it takes. And that's the same thing that happened with Ted Bundy. There was no regard of, well, you could become famous doing these evil things. Okay. The other thing I want to point out before we move on to looking at the chart is, remember, I recently made a video about the Aruda Lagna, and the Aruda Lagna is how people tend to see us, or how the world sees us. In Charles Manson's chart, the Aruda Lagna is actually the 9th house of Sagittarius. So it's very interesting when you get this idea of Manson was a cult leader or a guru to this group of young, naive, essentially kids. A lot of them were a lot younger. When Manson was going into, the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, he was already in his 30s, where a lot of these kids were like 18, getting in their Volkswagen Bugs and buses and going there. And so, a lot of them were naive, a lot of these kids coming from the Midwest and so forth. And so he was looked at as almost this father figure of, in strange ways, and a guru. Something you learn in spirituality is, there is a lot of power that a guru or a spiritual teacher can have over people, over followers. And there's been a lot of spiritual teachers that have been accused of misconduct throughout their lives because of this power that you can project over people and getting followers. It becomes very tempting to abuse that power. So when you guys are looking for your own gurus or spiritual teachers, it's important to really look at how is this person acting? Are they acting according to ethical conduct? Are they following, say, maybe the 5 precepts? You know, are they living honestly? Are they living in a ethical way? Because that is important. So yeah, enlightened person might think there's no self and nothing really matters, but there is still this code of conduct you need to follow as a spiritual teacher. So Charles Manson is essentially seen as a teacher, at least to these kids. I wouldn't say to the broader world, but this adds to this idea of mesmerism. Okay, being able to mesmerize people. Okay, now let's take a look at the sun. If you guys notice the sun in Charles Manson's chart, it's debilitated in the sign of Libra. So we got a debilitated sun there. Again, that's the sense of, you know, that's one of the trine lords. So this is a sense of dharma, the sense of purpose, the values. It could show the value system's really stunted, or the father, and I don't think the father was in Charles Manson's life. His childhood does seem very, you know, basically the parents weren't around to guide him. But this could also show a father that wasn't around or lacked any type of moral guidance. Okay, so there's no guidance there from childhood. And Venus is strong though. Venus is strong there. Jupiter's not strong. And then we got Mercury there, which is the 3rd and the 6th lord. So all these planets are kind of mashed together there in the 7th house of relationships. Interesting. So there's a lot of karma there. But interesting to note is the sun and Jupiter, which are usually considered very dharmic planets, especially for an Aries, these are very weak. And these are what give you your sense of dharma, or your sense of purpose, or your sense of ethics. Notice, so Jupiter doesn't do well in Libra. And then if we look at where Jupiter is in the Navamsa chart, again, it's not in a good house. It's in the sign of Aquarius. It's not strong in Aquarius. So Jupiter's not strong. There's that lack of ethics. Okay. And then Mercury is influencing all these, and that's the 6th lord. The 6th house has to do with crime, criminal behavior. And then look at this. Now, this is the best planet there, is Venus. So Venus is the strongest planet when we're looking at the 7th house. Interestingly enough, Venus does rule things like intoxicants, free love, relationships. That's all Venus type stuff, but in a corrupted way. So he was using this mask of desire, you know, with these naive people. And apparently he was even using these intoxicants to like manipulate people. He had this way of manipulating his followers through it, and also using these free love principles to manipulate people as well. But that's very interesting to note that Venus is kind of strong. Now, if we take a look at the dispositor of all these planets, so all of these planets here are being very strongly influenced by Venus because it's Libra. So because Venus is in its own house of Libra, that means that Venus is like the dispositor of all these other planets. So it's basically the heart and soul of those planets. Even though those planets have their own characteristics, Venus is the one that's really pulling the strings there, or Venus is the one giving them their motivations in the background, because they're all in Venus's house, and Venus is controlling that house. So that's something to be aware of. Let's take a look at, let me go back to the slideshow so you guys can kind of visualize, those of you guys that are visual learners. We already talked about Aswini, K2 ruled, 5th house of Leo, ambition for fame, that's Mars. Then he had the musical career, which is Mars in the 5th house. K2 in the fourth house of Cancer, disconnected from mother, disconnected from happiness, lack of empathy. Debilitated sun in Libra, moral guidance stunted, power issues, problems with authority. All right. Then we talked about Jupiter. Jupiter's weak in Libra, weak in the Navamsa chart. Jupiter's combust as well. I didn't bring that up, but it's close to the sun, so it's combust. So all the dharmic planets in Charles Manson's chart, he's an Aries. So the sun and, you know, The sun and Jupiter should be good planets for him, but they're weak. They're very weak. There's not a strong sense of guidance of ethics. And then Venus is the dispositor planet. So very interesting. I want you to be aware, let me go back really quick. When we're talking about Venus, it's important to realize that in Vedic mythology, Jupiter is considered the guru of the gods or of the devas. Okay, so Jupiter is actually called guru in Sanskrit. So Jupiter is considered like this really benefic, pure, optimistic teachings that are given to the gods. Okay, Venus is known as the guru of the asuras. Okay, the asuras were like demons in Vedic mythology. So it's interesting that Venus and Jupiter are both considered these teaching type of planets, but they both have this different type of teaching. Jupiter's like this high moral teaching. Venus is more of the teaching through human relationships and even somewhat of this left-hand path, using addictions, using taboo, using free love principles. That would be like the left-hand path, challenging these taboos to try to challenge your ego on some sort of level. That's why they call that the left-hand path. So Venus very much influences that. But at the end of the day, Venus is still a teacher on a broader level. Doesn't excuse Charles Manson, but on a broader level, when we're talking about Venus, Venus is still a teacher in a lot of ways. So let's go take a look here. So this is also where we really want to focus. Oops, this is where we want to focus. I'm sorry, guys. We got Saturn, Rahu, and Moon all in the 10th house. Now, Rahu is going to be given that desire to become famous or that desire for leadership. So 10th house can really surround leadership. I want to be a leader and I'm going to use any means necessary to become a leader. That's Rahu. Rahu doesn't care about breaking the law. Rahu doesn't care about finding a loophole to do whatever it needs to do to get what it's want. Rahu is just motivated by desire. Now, an interesting thing to note is when Rahu is with Saturn, and this is something I've studied quite a bit, it does tend to indicate, if you guys believe in this sort of thing, when we're talking about things like the occult or black magic or curses or mesmerism or really that really dark type of occult philosophy, even like witchcraft, but I'm talking about like that dark level of witchcraft. Okay, that usually there's Saturn and Rahu involved, and they're both either in the same house or they're both aspecting a house. So when somebody's looking for black magic or something like evil eye in a chart, they're going to be looking for this Rahu and Saturn influence. So it's interesting to note that these are both together in the 10th house. So there is this idea of Charles Manson using this mesmerism, through the intoxicants and through the behaviors, these behaviors that he was teaching them. He was using this way as with some sort of hypnotic effect on these followers, where they did these horrible things that got them life sentences in prison. I mean, that is a tremendous level of influence you have over somebody there. And that's with Saturn and Rahu. By the way, if any of you have Saturn and Rahu in your chart, a lot of times Saturn and Rahu combination can also indicate somebody who's like a shaman or somebody that understands spirits or knows how to work with spirits. So if any of you guys have that combination, investigate that. Now, it's not bad. I mean, you could have Rahu and Saturn together and be a very good light worker. You could be someone very positive. But in Charles Manson's case, there's kind of a lot of factors. And free will. We have to remember there's free will still happening in this chart. Okay. Somebody with this chart not necessarily is going to do the same thing as Charles Manson. Okay. Even though these are very difficult, these are very strong compulsions in the chart. So that's what we're looking at. We got Saturn, and then the fact that it's with the moon, we got these two cruel planets. Remember, when we're talking about the planets, Rahu, Ketu, which are shadow planets, or we're talking about Sun, Mars, or Saturn, those planets are considered cruel planets. So if they're associated with your moon it's showing you're having these cruel planets put pressure on your moon, either through anger, through fear, through harshness. So we're seeing a very disturbed, and then Rahu is definitely disturbing the mind. And I believe, if I remember right, I think Ted Bundy may have, and I'll have to look back on that presentation, there was something with Rahu and moon in his chart as well. So this is interesting to note that this Rahu influence on the moon, obviously it's not going to be a criminal in every case, because plenty of people have Rahu with moon, but it does show there's a disturbance there. Like if you don't really work on it, there could be a disturbance. Let's go back to, so we talked about that. We already talked about the mesmerism. We're going to go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the dashas that Charles Manson was in when he decided that he wanted to do all this stuff. It was like really in 1968 to 1970 was when all this chaos basically broke out. So it's interesting. Let's take a look. So in April of 1968, when he was forming this group, the Manson family, he was in a Rahu-Mars period. Isn't that interesting? Rahu and Mars are both involved. Rahu is how he was able to attract the followers through taboo behaviors and hypnotic effect. And then Mars also rules the 8th house, which has to do with the occult, okay? Or even like tantric practices. So let's take a look at that really quick. So when he's gaining his followers, he does happen to be, and I'm going to clean this up, he's in that Rahu period that we just talked about, mesmerism, with moon and with Saturn, able to mesmerize people, okay? And he's doing this with the motive of acquiring power, okay? Then he's in Mars Bhukti, okay? While he was forming this cult, I think he went to like a musical, if I got the story right, he went to like a musical executive because he was trying to basically become famous, and they basically didn't go with him. They didn't want to give him an album, or they didn't want to sponsor him for whatever reason. Well, this could be definitely an impetus of why he went and decided to form basically this doomsday cult, okay? So that's very interesting. Also, like I said, Mars in his chart, even though it rules the 1st house, it rules the 8th house, and this has to do a lot with the occult. So forming this whole thing, everything's with Rahu and Mars while he's forming the cult, okay? But then when we look at the actual murders, the murders actually happen in, I believe, August. We'll go back to the presentation just so I can get the dates right. But in August of 1969 is when Manson directs the followers to commit murder with hopes of causing social unrest. And that was the Sharon Tate murders, along with the La Bianca murders, okay, the next day. Interesting enough, he was actually entering the Jupiter Mahadasha. So let's talk about that for a moment. Because he just had entered the Jupiter Mahadasha when he directed his followers to do that. And some of you guys might be wondering, like, why would he do this during a Jupiter Mahadasha? This doesn't make sense because Jupiter is typically such a pleasant planet. You know, why would he do this during a Jupiter? Well, first off, remember what we were talking about earlier. He's kind of like this fallen guru. So there's this idea of, you know, he enters his Jupiter period in January of 1969, 8 months before these murders get committed. By the way, the energies are still kind of overlapping between the Rahu and the Jupiter period. So there's kind of an overlap of the energies. It usually takes a year or two for the energies to fully get online. But there's this idea of being a fallen guru. Remember, we talked about that. So Jupiter's being influenced by this debilitated sun. You know, it's being influenced by the dispositor Venus, and also influenced by the 6th lord there. So there is this idea of this corruption. It's like this corrupt guru, okay? And if we look at the chart, we'll notice that if we look at the Shadbala over here, Jupiter is the weakest planet for Charles Manson. It's weak in the Rashi chart, and it's weak in, so it's like, it's not a good planet for him. It could be, if it was better placed and it wasn't corrupted, it could have been an okay time. And we'll talk about this a little more in a second. But he's also, remember, when he's entering this Jupiter Mahadasha, he's also still being influenced a little bit by the energies of this Rahu and Mars period. Because there's this overlap called Dasha Sandhi. I'm going to make a video on this later, but there's this between Mahadashas, when you're shifting from one Mahadasha to a new Mahadasha, there's this overlap of energy called Dasha Sandhi. And you can actually calculate. There's an actual estimation where you can calculate the length of the Dasha Sandhi. And the Dasha Sandhi is basically like the energies are kind of mixed, where you might be getting various results, and then the new Mahadasha isn't fully online yet. Okay, so there's a little bit of a time delay. So he was still being influenced a lot by Rahu and Mars when he decided to do all these things. Also, if we take a look at the chart of Charles Manson, Jupiter's in the 8th house. And this also has to do with hidden things, secret societies. So there is this idea of catastrophic things that happen with it being the 8th house of the Navamsha chart. So definitely we could see the possibility of these horrible, atrocious acts being carried out. And let me take a look. I think that I don't have any more slides. Let me just take a more and more look here. Nope, that's it. All right. So it's a really interesting study to look at. And I don't see that I don't feel like, when we look at these charts and we look at astrology, we are talking about karma, we are talking about fate. But I don't see it necessarily that someone is fated to totally be evil. Now, you might have tendencies, which are known as samskaras, that make it very difficult to change your behavior. But like I said in previous videos, if you read Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, you find out that your free will is always still operative. Even if circumstances are difficult or you have certain tendencies, the free will is still operative. The last thing I wanted to point out, isn't it interesting that when Manson entered his Jupiter Mahadasha, it also owns the 12th house. It's the ruler of the 9th house and 12th house for Aries ascendant. And 12th house represents prisons. So in a way, it did really manifest the prison, in a negative way. 12th house can represent an ashram, but it also can represent literally being behind bars. So it's very interesting how there's these different polarities of what the 12th house could represent. So thank you guys for being here. I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions in the chat with any of the anyone that attended live. Thank you guys for being here. I hope you guys were able to learn a lot through this. I find these case studies absolutely fascinating. And what I'm going to do is we're going to do some more monthly predictions. I think I'm also going to be doing a chart really in the near future of Pope Francis. So I guess we're going to be doing some sinners and we're going to be doing some saints. So thank you guys for being here, and I appreciate you guys. If you guys are looking forward to a reading with me, check for details down below, and take care of yourselves until the next video.